In 1897, Judith and Elias Boone were born in the same hour, sharing a face so identical their mother marked Judith's wrist with lamp black to tell them apart. 26 years later, Judith would conceive a child with her twin brother, not out of passion or madness, but because she believed their bloodline demanded it. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The hollow where the Boone cabin stood had no proper name, just a geographical description the locals used. 3 miles past Crowder's Ridge, where the creek splits around the limestone shelf. The land was older than names, carved deep into the Appalachian mountains, a place where morning fog settled thick as wool and didn't burn off until noon, even in summer. The twins arrived during a late autumn storm, when their mother was 41 and their father 43. Rebecca Boone had suffered 4 miscarriages in the years prior, each one documented in the family journal with clinical precision, noting dates, symptoms, and probable causes. When the midwife finally placed 2 squalling infants in her arms instead of the single child she'd expected, Rebecca didn't smile. She studied their faces with an expression the midwife later described as recognition rather than surprise. "Twins again," Rebecca had whispered, not to the midwife or her husband, but to herself. After all these years, twins again. The Boone cabin was built from chestnut logs, darkened by decades of wood smoke, set back against a ridge that blocked the western sun. Inside, the main room served as kitchen, parlor, and workspace. 2 smaller rooms branched off, one for sleeping, one for storage. The storage room housed the family's true inheritance, 17 leather-bound journals stacked in a wooden crate, each filled with entries dating back to 1763. When the first Boones had claimed this particular fold in the mountains. From their earliest memories, Judith and Elias moved through the world as paired halves of a single consciousness. They developed a private language of gestures and half-words, communicating in glances what would take others full sentences to express. Their father, Marcus, taught them both to work the land, to read weather in the sky's color, to know which plants would heal and which would poison. Their mother taught them reading and basic arithmetic, though she focused these lessons primarily on Judith. "The girl needs to understand the records," Rebecca told Marcus when he questioned why Elias spent more time in the fields. "Someone has to maintain continuity." By the time the twins were 7, the differences between them had begun to emerge. Not in appearance, they remained mirror images, but in temperament and inclination. Elias possessed a natural ease with physical labor, his hands growing calloused and capable, his body adapting to the rhythm of planting and harvest. Judith was drawn inward, to the written word, to patterns and systems. She would sit for hours copying passages from her mother's journals, practicing the precise, controlled handwriting that characterized every Boone record. The land itself seemed to be failing. Crops that had sustained the family for generations produced diminishing yields. The soil, once rich and dark, had taken on a grayish cast. Trees along the property's border died from the inside out, their bark remaining intact, while the heartwood rotted to powder. Marcus would stand at the field's edge after a day's work, staring at the anemic corn stalks, his jaw working silently around words he never spoke aloud. When Judith was 12, she discovered her mother in the storage room, not reading the journals, but copying them. Rebecca sat at a small writing desk, transcribing entries from the oldest journal into a new ledger, her handwriting matching the original so precisely that the two texts appeared identical. "Why are you copying them?" Judith asked. Rebecca's pen paused mid-stroke. "Preservation. The old journals are fragile, but it's more than that." She gestured for Judith to come closer. "Do you know what these represent?" "Family history." "Instruction," Rebecca corrected. "Every generation of Boones has faced the same questions. The journals contain the answers they found." She turned to a page marked with a ribbon. "Read this entry, December 7th, 1806. Judith leaned over her mother's shoulder. The entry described a set of twin brothers, Samuel and Seth Boone, and a decision they'd made regarding the continuation of undivided heritage. The language was formal, almost legalistic, but the implication was clear enough to make 12-year-old Judith's stomach tighten. "I don't understand," Judith lied. "You will," Rebecca said. "When you're older, you'll understand that some bloodlines carry specific requirements. The Boones have always known this." She placed her hand on the journal. "Our family has survived longer than most in these mountains. Do you know why?" Judith shook her head. "Because we've been willing to do what preservation demands." That conversation marked a turning point. Rebecca began including Judith in longer sessions with the journals, guiding her through entries that documented births, deaths, marriages, and the slow decline that seemed to follow whenever the family deviated from certain patterns. Twins appeared in the Boone line with unusual frequency, sometimes skipping a generation, sometimes appearing in consecutive births. Rebecca taught Judith to trace these patterns, to see the correlations between twin births and periods of relative prosperity, between conventional marriages and times of hardship. Elias remained outside these lessons. He worked the fields with his father, learning to coax what growth he could from the exhausted soil, to repair equipment with wire and ingenuity, to hunt the ridges when crops failed. The division wasn't cruel, merely practical. The family functioned best when labor was allocated according to ability and inclination. When the twins were 17, Rebecca fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh February. She lasted 11 days, her breathing growing progressively more labored, despite the poultices and teas Judith prepared from Rebecca's own recipes. On the final night, Rebecca called Judith to her bedside, while Marcus and Elias slept in the main room. "The journals," Rebecca whispered, her voice thick with fluid. "You've read them all?" "Yes, Mama." "Then you understand what's required." Rebecca's hand, fever-hot and trembling, gripped Judith's wrist. "The line is collapsing. Can you see it? In the land, in the stillbirths, in your father's failing strength. We've been compromised." "How?" "By pretending we're like other families, by accepting limitations that don't apply to us." Rebecca's eyes were bright with fever or conviction, or both. "The old ways preserved us. The journals prove it. Every time we've abandoned them, we've diminished. Mama, you need to rest. Promise me you'll study the pattern. Promise me you'll see what needs to be done." Rebecca pulled Judith closer, her breath sharp with sickness. "Twins are meant to consolidate, not divide. That's the truth," they stopped speaking aloud. "But it's still written. It's all still written." Rebecca died before dawn. They buried her in the family plot up the ridge. 5 generations of Boones marked with simple limestone markers. Marcus stood silent throughout the brief service, his face empty of expression. 4 months later, Marcus was dead too. He went out to check trap lines and didn't return. Elias found him slumped against a hickory tree, his rifle across his lap. No mark on him, but a stillness that suggested his heart had simply decided to stop. At 17, Judith and Elias Boone found themselves alone in the hollow, inheritors of failing land, a deteriorating cabin, and 17 journals filled with generations of precise, obsessive documentation. The nearest neighbors lived 3 miles away. The nearest town, such as it was, lay 8 miles down a road that became impassable half the year. They were isolated, identical, and increasingly aware that their family's history suggested they were meant to be something more than siblings. Judith began reading the journals in earnest the week after they buried their father. Not casually, as she had under her mother's guidance, but systematically, creating her own index of recurring themes and documented outcomes. She filled a new journal with notes, cross-references, observations about patterns that spanned generations. Elias worked the land with grim determination, trying to reverse its decline through sheer physical effort. Never asked what Judith was reading, and she never volunteered the information. They maintained the surface routines of shared meals and divided labor, but something had shifted between them. They were growing into the knowledge their mother had tried to pass down, the understanding that their birth itself had been part of a pattern that demanded completion. In the evenings, they sat on opposite sides of the cabin's main room, Elias mending tools or checking ammunition, Judith reading by lamplight. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It had weight, it had intention, and it was waiting for one of them to break it. 6 years passed before the silence broke. During those years, the twins aged into their early 20s, settling into roles that felt both natural and confining. Elias managed the physical realm, planting what would grow, hunting game when crops failed, trading labor with distant neighbors for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Judith managed everything else, their modest finances, correspondence with the county office, and most importantly, the continuous study of the journals. She'd moved beyond simple reading. Now she compiled data the way a scientist might document an experiment. In a new ledger, she created tables tracking every twin birth in the Boone lineage against crop yields, livestock health, and family longevity. The correlations emerged with undeniable clarity. Generations that followed what the journals called the old practice thrived. Those that didn't declined. The journals never stated the practice explicitly. The language remained coded, wrapped in euphemism and agricultural metaphor. But Judith had her mother's guidance echoing in memory, and 6 years of isolation to think without interruption. She understood what the careful clinical entries truly described. What troubled her wasn't moral revulsion. It was the logical problem the practice attempted to solve. Twins represented biological redundancy, 2 identical carriers of the same genetic information. In any other species, nature resolved such redundancy through competition or consolidation. But human morality demanded they remained separate, distinct individuals living parallel lives. The journals suggested this was the source of the Boone family's recurring collapse. By forcing twins to live as separate bloodlines, they divided what should remain unified. The solution her ancestors had practiced was simple: consolidation through reproduction. Judith spent the winter of 1920 documenting her theory in precise, dispassionate prose. She wrote as if composing a research paper rather than proposing something that would horrify anyone beyond the hollow. Her entries contained no emotional language, no romantic justification, just observation, hypothesis, and supporting evidence drawn from 5 generations of Boone family records. When spring arrived, and the mountain laurel bloomed white across the ridges, Judith finally showed her work to Elias. She waited until evening, after supper, when they'd normally retreat to their separate activities. Instead, she placed her ledger on the table between them and opened it to the first page of her compiled findings. "I need you to read this," she said. Elias looked at the neat columns of dates and outcomes, the careful annotations. "What is it?" "An explanation for why our parents died young, why the land is failing, why we're the only Boones left in this hollow when there used to be dozens." She tapped the page. "Read it, all of it. Then we'll talk." It took him 3 hours to work through her documentation. Judith sat across from him, watching his face change as comprehension settled in. She saw the moment he understood what she was proposing. His hands stilled on the page. His breathing altered. "No," he said, not looking up. "I'm not asking yet. I'm showing you the pattern." "I don't care about the pattern." He closed the ledger. "This is madness, Judith. It's documentation. Every claim I've made is supported by family records. The evidence is irrefutable." "Evidence of what? That our ancestors committed sins and called it preservation?" Elias stood, putting distance between himself and the table. "That's not a pattern to continue. That's a curse to end." Judith remained seated, her expression unchanged. "The curse is what's happening now. Look around. We're dying out. The last 2 Boones, barely surviving on land that's turning to dust. That's the result of abandoning what worked. What worked was wrong. According to whose morality? The same outside world that's never had to survive in isolation? She opened the ledger again, turning to a specific entry. "Here, 1853. The last time twins followed the old practice. For the next 30 years, the family thrived. Healthy children, productive land, prosperity. Then, in 1883, the next set of twins refused. They married outside the family. Within 20 years, half the line had died out. Correlation isn't causation. It is when it repeats across 5 generations." Judith's voice remained level, reasonable. "I'm not speaking from emotion. I'm presenting data. Our bloodline has specific requirements. We can acknowledge them, or we can be the generation that ends." Elias moved to the door, his back to her. "I won't do this. I can't. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to think about it, to consider whether your moral comfort is worth the extinction of our family." He left without responding, walking out into the spring darkness. Judith closed her ledger and returned it to the storage room, placing it beside the 17 journals that had brought her to this conclusion. She felt no anger at his refusal, no disappointment. She'd expected resistance. The journals showed that the practice had always required one twin to convince the other, to present the logic until it became undeniable. She had time. They had nowhere else to go. No other family, no life beyond this hollow. Eventually, isolation and logic would overcome his resistance. Eventually, he would see what needed to be done. Judith returned to the main room and began preparing for bed, her movements methodical and calm. Outside, she could hear Elias pacing the porch, wrestling with information he couldn't unknow. The waiting had begun. The conversation didn't happen again for months, but its presence filled every corner of the cabin like smoke from a fire that wouldn't go out. Elias threw himself into physical labor with renewed intensity, as if exhaustion might erase what he'd read. He cleared new fields, repaired fences that didn't need repairing, walked trap lines twice as often as necessary. When he came home each evening, dirt-stained and hollow-eyed, he ate in silence and retreated to his room before Judith could speak. She didn't push. Instead, she continued her research with the same methodical patience she'd always possessed. What she discovered in those months went deeper than anything her mother had shown her. The journals didn't just document the practice. They revealed its biological logic in ways that made conventional morality seem like willful blindness. In 1829, a Boone ancestor named Ephraim had written an entry that Judith read dozens of times, memorizing every word. Ephraim had been a twin, and his writing suggested he'd studied medicine before retreating to the mountains. His entry described twins as nature's attempt at perfection through redundancy, two seeds planted where one would suffice, waiting to see which proved superior. But the Boones weren't competing. They were identical. And that, Ephraim argued, created a unique circumstance. When identical twins reproduce with outsiders, he'd written, they create divergent lines from singular origin. Each generation fragments further from the source, but consolidation reverses this fragmentation. It creates offspring that carry undiluted heritage from both parents because both parents are genetically identical. This is not degeneration. This is preservation in its purest form. Judith understood what he meant. The concern about genetic problems from close relation assumed diversity lost. But identical twins had no diversity to lose. They were already the same. Reproduction between them wasn't mixing genes. It was maintaining them. The logic was elegant, troubling, but elegant. She expanded her documentation to include physiological observations. She tracked her own cycles with scientific precision, noting patterns and optimal timing. She researched fertility through the medical texts she could acquire from the county library, traveling the 8 miles each month to return books and borrow new ones. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Cooperton, eventually asked why a young woman living alone with her brother needed so many books on animal husbandry and reproductive biology. "We're expanding the livestock," Judith answered smoothly. "Want to understand the science behind breeding." Mrs. Cooperton accepted this explanation, though her eyes lingered on Judith with something that might have been pity or suspicion. By late summer, Judith had filled 3 new journals with her findings. She'd created breeding charts that would work for any species, calculated optimal timing based on lunar cycles and seasonal temperature variations, and documented everything in prose so clinical it read like veterinary instruction. The only variable she couldn't control was Elias's cooperation. She began leaving her journals open on the table where he'd see them during meals. Not the disturbing ones about family history, but her new research, the scientific material. She wanted him to understand that she'd moved beyond ancestral superstition into empirical methodology. One evening in September, he finally acknowledged what she was doing. "You're planning this," he said, staring at a chart she'd left visible. "Not theorizing. Planning." "Yes. Without my consent. I can't proceed without your involvement, obviously." She folded her hands on the table. "But I can prepare for when you accept the inevitability." "There's no inevitability." "There is. We're 23 years old. We have, perhaps, 20 fertile years remaining. The longer we wait, the higher the risk of complications. From a practical standpoint, we should begin within the next 2 years. Elias stood so abruptly, his chair fell backward. "Listen to yourself. You're talking about this like it's crop rotation." "Why shouldn't I? What difference does emotional language make to biological reality?" She remained seated, her voice steady. "The journals prove the practice works. My research explains why it works. The only question is whether you'll acknowledge facts or hide behind feelings." "Feelings?" His voice rose for the first time in months. "Is that what you call basic human decency? Feelings? I call it conditioning. Social rules designed for people who have alternatives. We don't. We're the last Boones. Everything ends with us, unless we do what's necessary." "Then let it end." He grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. "Maybe that's better than whatever you want to create." He left, and this time Judith heard him saddling the horse. He'd be gone for hours, maybe overnight, riding the ridges to escape the cabin and the conversation, and the sister who'd stopped being recognizable. Judith collected her charts and journals, returning them to their proper places. She felt no frustration with his resistance. The journals showed that acceptance came gradually, worn down by isolation and logic, and the simple fact that no other future existed. She was patient. She was methodical. And she was absolutely certain she was right. Outside, thunder rumbled across the mountains. The first storm of autumn was coming. Judith lit a lamp against the gathering darkness and opened a fresh journal, beginning a new entry about timing and optimal conditions. The waiting continued. Winter arrived early that year, trapping them together in the cabin for weeks at a time. The snow started in November and didn't stop. It buried the fence lines, made the road to town impassable, and turned the hollow into a white tomb where the only sounds were wind and the occasional crack of ice-weighted branches breaking. The isolation that had always defined their lives became absolute. Judith used the time strategically. She cooked meals that required them to sit together. She initiated conversations about practical matters, cabin repairs, food stores, anything to maintain normalcy, while slowly reintroducing the topic that hung between them. She never mentioned the journals directly. Instead, she spoke about futures. "We'll need more supplies come spring," she said one evening as they ate venison stew. "The root cellar's half empty. We can't sustain ourselves much longer without help." Elias nodded, not meeting her eyes. "We could leave," she continued. "Sell the property, move to town, find work." "Maybe we should." "And do what? You're a farmer with no education beyond what Papa taught you. I'm a woman with no skills anyone would pay for. We'd end up in a tenement, working factory jobs if we're lucky, dying young from bad air and worse food." She let that settle. "Or we stay here, on land that's ours, and we do what's necessary to make it viable again." "Judith," his voice carried a warning, "I'm speaking practically, nothing more." But she was doing more, much more. She'd begun altering her behavior in subtle ways, small gestures that weren't quite romantic but weren't entirely sisterly either. Sitting closer than necessary when reviewing household accounts, letting her hand linger on his shoulder when she passed behind his chair. Nothing overt enough to acknowledge, but enough to make him aware of her as something other than his mirror image. The journals had documented this too. The psychological preparation. The gradual erosion of boundaries that had been arbitrary to begin with. By December, she judged him ready for directness. She waited until a night when the wind howled so fiercely that conversation felt like the only defense against the storm's fury. They sat near the fireplace, the only warm spot in the cabin, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I want to ask you something," Judith said, "and I need you to answer honestly." Elias stiffened. "I know what you're going to ask." "Then you also know I won't stop asking." She turned to face him fully. "We're 23, the same age our parents were when they married. Neither of us has prospects elsewhere. Neither of us wants to leave this place. We're genetically identical. which means any offspring would carry pure Boone heritage without the degradation that comes from outside bloodlines. Stop. I've done the research, Elias. Medical research. The concerns about close relation don't apply to identical twins. We're not risking genetic diversity because we don't have diversity between us. We're the same person in two bodies. That's what makes this work. He stood, moving away from the fire. You've convinced yourself this is science. It isn't. It's justification for something you know is wrong. Wrong according to people who'll never face what we're facing, who have families and futures and choices. Her voice remained calm, logical. We have this land and each other. Nothing else. Our bloodline ends unless we're willing to do what our ancestors did. Let it end then. You don't mean that. She rose, following him across the room. You've spent 6 years trying to save this land, working yourself to exhaustion trying to make something grow in soil that won't support life anymore. You care about preservation just as much as I do. You're just afraid to admit what form that preservation has to take. I'm not afraid. I'm moral. Morality is a luxury for people with options. Judith stepped closer. We don't have that luxury. We have a choice. Continue pretending we're normal siblings with normal futures, or acknowledge what we actually are. Which is what? The last chance. The final iteration of a bloodline that survived in these mountains for over a century. We can let it die out of cowardice, or we can do what's necessary. The firelight cast shadows across Elias's face, making him look older than his years. If we do this, there's no going back. We'd have to live with it forever. We're already living with it. The question isn't whether to carry this burden. It's whether we carry it forward or let everything our family built turn to dust. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the fire's crackle and the wind's scream. Finally, Elias spoke. No. My answer is no, and it will stay no. You need to accept that. He went to his room and shut the door, leaving Judith alone with the fire and her certainty. She didn't feel defeated. She felt patient. The journals showed that first refusals were common, expected even. What mattered was persistence. Consistent, logical, patient persistence that eventually wore down resistance the way water wore down stone. Judith added more wood to the fire and retrieved her newest journal. She documented the conversation, noting his specific objections and planning her responses. She had charts to refine, arguments to sharpen, time to invest. Outside, the storm buried the hollow deeper in snow, sealing them in together. Months would pass before the roads cleared. Months she would use well. Spring came, and with it, a shift in Judith's strategy. She stopped arguing, stopped leaving journals open, stopped initiating conversations about their future. Instead, she simply documented. Her new journal was different from the others. This one tracked variables with absolute precision. Her physiological cycles, lunar phases, temperature fluctuations, Elias's patterns of work and rest. She recorded everything as if conducting a long-term scientific study, which in her mind, she was. She noted when he seemed most exhausted, most isolated, most vulnerable to suggestion. She documented the moments when their old closeness resurfaced, those brief instances when they'd laugh at some shared memory or finish each other's sentences the way they had as children. Those were the cracks in his resistance. The journals from previous generations had included similar documentation. Her ancestors hadn't relied on passion or persuasion alone. They'd understood that timing mattered. Context mattered. Exhaustion and isolation, and the slow wearing down of will Those mattered most of all. Judith was 24 now. Time remained, but not infinitely. She'd calculated optimal windows based on age, health, and environmental factors. Within 2 years would be ideal. After that, risks increased incrementally, but manageable. Beyond 30, the journals suggested complications became more likely. She had 6 years to work with. 6 years to apply steady pressure. That summer, she implemented a new approach: practical dependence. She began asking Elias for help with tasks she could have managed alone. Nothing suspicious, just the normal division of labor in a household where traditional roles had always been fluid. But she made sure he noticed, made sure he understood how much they relied on each other, how impossible it would be to maintain the property without both of them working in coordination. By autumn, the isolation had deepened. Their nearest neighbor had died over the winter. The next closest family had moved away, seeking better land. The hollow was emptying, leaving the Boones more alone than ever. Judith documented this too. Geographic isolation. Social isolation. The complete absence of alternatives. She never mentioned her observations to Elias. She simply maintained them, knowing that eventually the weight of documentation would matter. Eventually, logic would overcome emotion. Eventually, exhaustion would crack resolve. The journals promised this. Every single ancestral account confirmed it. And Judith had inherited her family's greatest trait: patience married to absolute certainty. She could wait. The change happened on a February night, 2 years after Judith's first proposition. Elias had been injured while clearing fallen timber. Nothing severe, but enough to leave him dependent on Judith's care for a week. She tended the wound with clinical efficiency, changing bandages, preparing meals, managing the property alone while he recovered. On the 7th night, as she helped him back to bed, he caught her wrist. "You were right," he said quietly. "There's no one else. There never will be." Judith said nothing. She'd learned that silence served better than argument. "I've thought about leaving," he continued, 100 times, walking down that mountain and never coming back. But I can't. This place is all I know. You're all I know. I understand. Do you? His grip tightened slightly. Do you understand what you're asking me to become? I'm asking you to survive. That's all. To acknowledge reality instead of fighting it. She met his eyes. We're the last Boones. Every choice we make either continues the line or ends it. There's no neutral ground. Something broke behind his expression. Not acceptance exactly, more like surrender. Judith documented the moment later in her journal, noting the date, the conditions, the psychological factors that had finally aligned. She wrote in the same clinical prose she'd maintained throughout, treating the breakthrough as she would any experimental milestone. 3 weeks later, she made the entry she'd been preparing for years to write. Conception confirmed. 4 words, no emotion, no elaboration, just fact documented with the precision that had always characterized Boone record-keeping. She told Elias the following morning over breakfast, her tone matter-of-fact. I'm pregnant. Based on my tracking, conception occurred 17 days ago. Everything proceeded according to documentation. He stared at his plate, not eating. Are you certain? Yes. The indicators are consistent with what the journals describe. What have we done? His voice was barely audible. What was necessary? Judith resumed eating. Now we wait. The journals indicate pregnancy will be different, but viable. I've prepared for anticipated complications. Elias left the table without finishing his meal. Through the window, Judith watched him walk toward the tree line, his shoulders bent under weight that would never lift. She continued eating methodically. There was work to be done, preparations to finalize, documentation to maintain. The pregnancy was just the beginning. The truly important part would be what came after. The journals had been very specific about that. The pregnancy was wrong from the beginning. Judith tracked every deviation from normal gestation with the same clinical detachment she'd applied to everything else. By the second month, the differences became undeniable. Growth occurred unevenly. Her abdomen expanded asymmetrically, one side developing faster than the other. The movement inside didn't feel like kicks. It felt purposeful, deliberate, as if something was testing the boundaries of its confinement. She documented everything, measurements that didn't align with standard development, physical sensations that had no medical precedent, dreams so vivid they felt like memories, though they belonged to no life she'd lived. By the 5th month, she could no longer hide the pregnancy from outside observation. A traveling peddler who stopped at the cabin stared at her midsection with poorly concealed alarm before making excuses to leave quickly. Judith noted his reaction in her journal under external validation of abnormality. The journals from previous generations had mentioned this. Pregnancies resulting from twin consolidation didn't follow conventional patterns. The offspring carried something extra, something the journals described as concentrated heritage, but never defined precisely. Elias couldn't look at her anymore. He spent his days working the far fields, returning only after dark, eating in silence before retreating to his room. The guilt was destroying him in slow motion. Judith felt no guilt, only fascination. By the 7th month, she knew she needed help for the birth, not from choice, but from necessity. The physical demands would exceed what she could manage alone. She sent word to the midwife in the next valley, a woman named Mrs. Holloway, who'd delivered half the children in 3 counties. The message was simple. Complications expected. Assistance required. Payment guaranteed. Mrs. Holloway arrived in late September, a sturdy woman in her 60s, who'd seen every variation of difficult birth. She examined Judith with professional efficiency, her expression neutral until she felt the movement inside. Her hands stilled. "What is this?" "A pregnancy. It's not moving like any child I've felt." Mrs. Holloway stepped back. "How far along are you?" "Nearly 8 months. The size is wrong. The positioning is wrong. Everything about this is wrong." The midwife's professional calm cracked. "Who's the father? That's not relevant to the delivery. It's relevant to what I'm being asked to help bring into this world." Mrs. Holloway gathered her bag. "I should leave." "You won't." Judith's voice remained steady. "You'll stay because you're a midwife, and your oath requires you to attend births regardless of circumstance, and because I'm paying you more than you'd make in 6 months otherwise." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Mrs. Holloway set her bag down. "God forgive me." "He won't need to," Judith said. "This isn't sin, it's evolution." Labor began 3 weeks early, on a moonless October night. Judith had prepared the cabin according to the journal's instructions. Candles arranged in specific patterns, windows covered, mirrors turned to face the walls. Mrs. Holloway had questioned these preparations, but ultimately accepted them as cultural superstition, not understanding they were documented protocol from previous consolidation births. Elias was sent to wait outside. He didn't argue. The labor lasted 14 hours. Judith refused all pain relief, insisting she needed to remain fully conscious. Mrs. Holloway had never seen a woman maintain such control during childbirth. No screaming, no pleading, just focused breathing and clinical self-observation. "Something's wrong with the presentation," Mrs. Holloway said near the 10th hour. her hands trembling as she examined Judith. "I can't determine the position. It's like nothing I've encountered." "Follow the process," Judith said, through controlled breaths. "Don't interfere unless there's actual danger." "This is actual danger." "No, this is different. There's a distinction." What emerged in the final hour made Mrs. Holloway stumble. Backward, her professional composure shattered completely. She would later refuse to describe what she'd seen, would burn her own notes from the delivery, would wake screaming for months afterward. The child was alive. That much was certain. It breathed. It moved. But Mrs. Holloway would only say that it was transitional, a word she couldn't explain, but repeated obsessively when pressed. Judith held the newborn with the same clinical detachment she'd maintained throughout the pregnancy. She examined it systematically, noting observations in a journal she'd prepared for this specific purpose. Her handwriting remained steady. "It's viable," she announced. The consolidation was successful. Mrs. Holloway gathered her things with shaking hands. "I need to leave. Now." "You'll be paid as agreed, and you'll speak to no one about what happened here. You think I'd tell anyone? You think I could find words?" The midwife's face had aged years in 14 hours. "What you've done, what you've brought into this world, that's on your soul, not mine." She fled the cabin before dawn, refusing payment, refusing any further contact. She would tell people only that the Boone woman had delivered successfully, offering no details despite repeated questioning. Elias entered after Mrs. Holloway left. He looked at the bundle in Judith's arms and immediately turned away, his hand covering his mouth. "You can't even look?" Judith asked calmly. "No, God help me, no." He walked out and kept walking, disappearing into the morning mist that clung to the hollow like a burial shroud. Elias didn't return that night, or the next. Judith cared for the child alone, following protocols documented in the journals with the same methodical precision she'd applied to everything else. The infant required specialized attention. Its patterns of sleep and waking didn't align with typical newborn behavior. It seemed to observe rather than simply react, tracking movement with an awareness that disturbed even Judith, though she noted this observation clinically rather than emotionally. She named it Morgan, a gender-neutral name common in the Boone lineage. The journals suggested that consolidation offspring sometimes exhibited characteristics that made traditional gender classification inadequate. Judith documented this as another successful prediction. On the third day, Elias returned. He looked gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper. He'd walked the ridges without food or rest, trying to outpace what he'd witnessed, what he'd helped create. "I can't stay here," he said from the doorway, refusing to enter. Judith sat in the rocking chair, Morgan wrapped in blankets that concealed its form. "Where will you go?" "Anywhere. Town, another state. It doesn't matter." "You'll tell people what happened here?" "No." His voice was flat. "I'll never speak of this. I'll never speak of you. I'll disappear, and anyone who asks will be told I died in these mountains. That's probably wise." Judith adjusted the bundle in her arms. The journals indicate that the contributing male often cannot sustain proximity to consolidation offspring. It's documented as a natural response. You're following pattern. "Stop talking like that." For the first time in years, emotion cracked through his exhaustion. "Stop acting like this is science. You brought something into this world that shouldn't exist. Can't you see that? Can't you feel it?" "I feel that the Boone line continues. That's what I set out to accomplish." Elias stared at her, this woman who wore his face, who'd once been the other half of his consciousness. She'd become something he no longer recognized, Perhaps she'd always been this, and he'd simply refused to see it until too late. "The land won't prosper," he said quietly. "Whatever you think you've done, it won't work the way the journals promised. This isn't preservation. It's corruption." The journals never promised immediate results. They documented generational patterns. We won't see the full effect in our lifetime. Then what was the point? Continuation. Judith stood, still cradling the bundle. Everything else is secondary to that. Our ancestors understood this. Now I understand it. You never did, and that's why you have to leave. He backed away from the cabin, his eyes never leaving her. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stop you. You couldn't have stopped me. The pattern was already set. You were just another variable I had to account for." She spoke without cruelty, simply stating fact. "Goodbye, Elias." He turned and walked down the mountain path. Judith watched until he disappeared around the ridge, then turned inside and closed the door. She felt no sadness at his departure, no sense of loss. The journals had prepared her for this outcome. Twins who underwent consolidation rarely remained together afterward. The psychological strain was too severe for the male participant. She was better off alone anyway. Morgan required constant attention, and Elias had become a distraction rather than a help. The weeks that followed established new patterns. Judith maintained the property as best she could, managing tasks that had previously required 2 people. The work was exhausting, but she'd prepared for it. She'd spent years conditioning herself for self-sufficiency. Morgan developed rapidly, far faster than the journals had indicated. By 6 weeks, it demonstrated awareness that should have taken months. By 3 months, it was mobile in ways that defied typical infant development. Judith documented everything, her journals filling with observations that would have seemed impossible to anyone trained in conventional medicine. The child didn't cry, not once. It made sounds, certainly, but they weren't distressed vocalizations. They were communicative, purposeful, as if it understood the futility of infantile expression and had moved beyond it. Neighbors stopped visiting. The few who came to check on Judith after word spread that Elias had left would stand at the property line, calling out rather than approaching the cabin. When Judith emerged to speak with them, they'd note how she looked unchanged, almost thriving, while the cabin behind her seemed to have aged years in months. "You managing all right on your own?" asked Thomas Cooper, the closest thing to a neighbor the hollow still had. "Yes, we're managing well." "We? Thought your brother left." "He did. I meant the child and myself." Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "Right. The child. Haven't seen it much. Morgan doesn't tolerate visitors well. Sensitivity to stimulation. Common in unusual births. Mrs. Holloway won't talk about the delivery. That normal for her? I couldn't say." Judith's expression remained neutral. "Is there something specific you needed, Thomas?" "Just checking in, making sure you're all right up here alone." "I'm not alone." Something in how she said it made Cooper take a step back. "Right. Well, you need anything? You send word." He left quickly, and Judith added the interaction to her documentation. External social contact was becoming impossible. The hollow was naturally isolating them, which the journals suggested was part of the process. Consolidation offspring required separation from conventional society during their developmental years. By Morgan's first year, the changes in the property became noticeable even from a distance. The soil around the cabin had taken on a different color, darker, but not in a healthy way. Plants grew in unusual patterns, following geometries that seemed almost intentional. The air itself felt different, heavier, as if the hollow was transforming into something separate from the surrounding mountains. Judith documented these changes with satisfaction. The journals had mentioned environmental adaptation. The land was responding to Morgan's presence, preparing for the next phase of development. Census takers who came to the hollow reported only one occupant, but their notes included strange observations. Footsteps heard inside the cabin that didn't sync with each other. Shadows in windows that seemed to move independently of light sources. Breathing patterns audible through the walls that suggested multiple individuals. Despite Judith's insistence, she lived alone. When questioned about these discrepancies, Judith would calmly explain that the cabin was old, that sounds carried strangely through the hollow, that isolation played tricks on perception. The census takers accepted these explanations because the alternatives were too disturbing to consider. Morgan was 5 years old when the first direct observation occurred. A hunter who'd gotten lost in the ridges stumbled near the Boone property at dusk. He saw Judith standing in the doorway, and beside her, something that might have been a child, but moved in ways that made his eyes hurt to track. He left the mountains entirely after that, selling his land for a fraction of its value. By 10 years, no one would approach the hollow at all. The Boone cabin had developed a reputation that kept even the bravest hunters at a distance. Stories circulated, each more disturbing than the last. But no one could verify them, because no one would venture close enough to see clearly. Judith was 43 when a young journalist doing a story on isolated Appalachian communities finally worked up the courage to approach the property. She found Judith standing in the doorway, looking barely aged, despite the decades that had passed. "Can I help you?" Judith asked politely. "I'm writing about families that have maintained their land for generations. The Boones have been here since before statehood." "That's correct." "Do you live alone?" "No, I have a child." The journalist glanced past Judith into the dim interior. "May I meet them?" "Morgan doesn't interact with outsiders. Congenital condition." "I see. And the child's father?" "Left years ago. It's just Morgan and myself now." The journalist noticed something then. Behind Judith, in the shadows, movement that didn't correspond to any visible source. Multiple breathing patterns that seemed to originate from the same space, but at different rhythms. "How old is your child?" the journalist asked, her professionalism barely masking her unease. "Old enough to understand what we are," Judith smiled slightly, "and young enough to still be developing into what we'll become." "We?" It required consent, adulthood, and precision. Judith's hand moved to her side, and something in the shadows behind her shifted in response. "That's why it worked this time. Previous generations failed because they lacked one or more of those elements. But I maintained all three throughout the process." The journalist backed away slowly. "I should go. Thank you for your time." "Of course. Few come this far anymore. The hollow prefers it that way." As the journalist retreated down the mountain, she looked back once. Judith remained in the doorway, but the shadows behind her had expanded, and within them, shapes moved that suggested more than one occupant, yet not quite two distinct individuals either. The Boone bloodline didn't end. It changed. The journalist's article never ran. Her editor rejected it, claiming it read more like horror fiction than journalism. When pressed for details, the journalist could only repeat what Judith had said about consent, adulthood, and precision. Words that meant nothing without context she couldn't bring herself to provide. But the story spread anyway, the way stories do in isolated regions where oral tradition holds more weight than printed news. The Boone Hollow became a location people referenced in warnings rather than directions. "Don't go past Crowder's Ridge where the creek splits." Stay clear of that fold in the mountains where the Boone woman lives. Lives. Present tense. Despite decades passing. In 1953, a group of university researchers studying Appalachian folklore made the mistake of approaching the property without permission. They were documenting abandoned homesteads and assumed the Boone cabin qualified, given its reputation and the lack of recent census data. They found Judith in the doorway, as she always seemed to be when visitors arrived, as if she knew they were coming before they appeared. She looked to be in her 50s, which was impossible, given that she would have been nearly 60 by that year. "Can I help you?" she asked, the same polite greeting she'd used for decades. The lead researcher, a professor named Dr. Harrison, explained their project. Judith listened patiently, her hands folded in front of her, her expression pleasant but distant. "This property isn't abandoned," she said when he finished. "We're still here." "We?" Dr. Harrison glanced past her into the cabin's interior, where shadows seemed to move with purpose rather than in response to light. "My child and I. Morgan is 28 now, still developing, but progressing well according to the documentation." One of the graduate students, a young woman named Sarah, asked the question the others were thinking. 28 years old and still developing? Consolidation offspring mature differently. The journals predicted this. Extended developmental periods allow for more complete transformation. Judith spoke as if discussing crop rotations, her voice carrying no awareness of how disturbing her words sounded. "Transformation into what?" Dr. Harrison asked. Judith's expression shifted slightly, the first genuine emotion she'd shown. Not anger or defensiveness, but something closer to satisfaction. "That's the question, isn't it? The journals could only speculate based on incomplete cycles. Previous attempts failed before reaching full maturation. But Morgan has survived past all documented precedents. We're entering unprecedented territory." "May we speak with Morgan?" Sarah asked. "No, Morgan doesn't interact with outsiders anymore. The sensitivity to external stimuli has intensified over the years. Even my presence is sometimes difficult to tolerate, despite our connection." "What kind of connection?" Dr. Harrison's academic curiosity was overcoming his unease. "Biological, genetic. More than that, actually. The consolidation created something that exists in the space between individual identity and unified consciousness. Morgan isn't entirely separate from me, but isn't entirely merged either. It's a transitional state that the journals called productive ambiguity. Behind Judith, inside the cabin, something moved. All three researchers saw it. A shape that was humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways. Proportions that didn't quite align. Movement that suggested multiple points of articulation where there should be fewer. "We should go," Sarah whispered to Dr. Harrison. "Yes," he agreed, though he continued addressing Judith. "Thank you for your time. We'll make note that the property is still occupied." "That would be accurate, though I suspect Morgan will outlive any records you might create." Judith stepped back slightly, preparing to close the door. "The transformation is nearly complete. Another decade, perhaps 2. Then we'll know if the consolidation achieved what the journals promised." "Which is what?" Dr. Harrison couldn't help asking. "Perpetuation without division. A bloodline that doesn't fragment across generations, but accumulates, concentrating rather than dispersing. The Boones have always understood that identical twins are nature's attempt to create redundancy. We simply completed what nature started." She closed the door before they could respond. The research team left the hollow quickly, their documentation of the encounter frustratingly vague. Dr. Harrison would later admit that he couldn't find adequate language to describe what he'd seen in the shadows behind Judith. His report mentioned unusual domestic arrangements and isolated individual with non-standard beliefs about heredity. The truth was too disturbing for academic language. By 1970, the Boone property had become something that existed on maps, but wasn't quite part of the physical landscape anymore. Survey crews reported spatial anomalies around the hollow. Compasses behaved erratically. Distances didn't measure consistently. The area had developed a reputation for disorienting even experienced outdoorsmen. Judith was seen occasionally in town, looking essentially unchanged, despite the passage of decades. She purchased supplies with coins that appeared to be from different eras, including some that predated her birth. Store clerks accepted her money without comment, grateful when she left without incident. Questions about her age or her child were met with the same calm responses. We age differently in the hollow. Morgan is developing according to pattern. The transformation takes time. In 1985, a documentary filmmaker convinced himself he could succeed where others had failed. He approached the property with recording equipment, determined to capture evidence of whatever was happening in the Boone cabin. He found Judith in the doorway. She looked to be in her late 40s, which was impossible, given that she would have been over 80 by any rational calculation. "You're not welcome to film here," she said before he could introduce himself. "I'm documenting unusual families in Appalachia. The Boones have been here longer than most. That's worth recording. Our family doesn't require external documentation. We maintain our own records." Judith's hand rested on the doorframe, and behind her, something shifted in response to her touch. "The journals contain everything that matters." "What journals?" "The family history. 17 original volumes plus my additions. Over 200 years of documentation. Every twin birth, every consolidation attempt, every failure and success. It's all recorded. I'd like to see them." "That's impossible. The journals are for Boone use only. They contain knowledge that requires specific context to understand safely." The filmmaker noticed something then. Behind Judith, in the cabin's interior, there were no distinct shadows anymore. Just a single presence that seemed to occupy multiple spaces simultaneously. A darkness that suggested form without clearly defining it. "Is that Morgan?" he asked, pointing past Judith. She didn't turn to look. "Morgan is completing the final phase. The distinction between us is becoming less relevant. That's what consolidation ultimately produces. Not a child separate from its source, but an extension that eventually reintegrates in transformed state. That's not how biology works. It's how Boone biology works." Judith smiled, and for the first time, the expression seemed genuinely amused rather than polite. "That's what you people never understand. We're not bound by your limitations. The journals proved that generations ago. We just needed the right variables, identical twins, proper timing, and the will to follow through despite external morality." The filmmaker backed away slowly, his equipment forgotten. "You're talking about something that shouldn't be possible. And yet here we are, still continuing, still transforming. The Boone line doesn't end, it evolves." She closed the door, and the filmmaker ran. His footage showed nothing but shadows and audio interference. The documentary never aired. The last confirmed sighting of Judith was in 1993, when a hiker lost on the ridges stumbled into the hollow at dusk. He reported seeing a woman standing in the doorway of a cabin that seemed to exist at the edge of visibility, solid one moment and translucent the next. She was holding something, though he couldn't determine what. Or perhaps she wasn't holding anything at all, but was instead merged with something that stood beside her, behind her, within her. She spoke to him, though he couldn't remember her exact words later. Something about consent and precision and transformation. Something about bloodlines that don't end, but change. He fled, and when rangers tried to find the location based on his description, they couldn't. The hollow had disappeared from reliable geography, existing now only in stories and warnings. The Boone cabin remains on old property maps, but no longer appears in satellite imagery. The space where it should be shows only distortion, as if the area refuses to be properly documented by modern technology. Locals say that on certain nights, when fog settles thick in the mountains, you can still hear sounds from the hollow. Not quite voices, not quite footsteps. Something that suggests presence without confirming it. Breathing patterns that sync and unsync. Rhythms that indicate life without revealing its form. The Boone bloodline didn't end. It changed. And somewhere in that fold in the mountains, in a hollow that exists between geography and myth, continues to change still. Judith's final journal entry, discovered years later by researchers who broke into an abandoned Boone property miles from the hollow, contained only one line. It required consent, adulthood, and precision. That's why it worked this time. The rest of the pages were filled with symbols that resembled writing, but couldn't be translated. Patterns that suggested language, but communicated nothing to anyone who wasn't a Boone. The journals themselves disappeared shortly after being photographed. How they left a locked research facility remains unexplained. Some things, it seems, prefer to remain documented only by those who understand what the documentation truly means. If this story disturbed you, if it made you question what's possible in those isolated places where old families maintain old practices, then you understand why some bloodlines refuse to end conventionally. Hit that like button if you appreciate stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about what survival might actually require. And subscribe, because we're just getting started exploring the darkness that exists in America's forgotten hollows, where family legacies aren't what they seem, and transformation takes forms you never imagined possible. The Boones proved that continuation matters more than convention. What other families in isolated regions might have discovered the same truth? We'll find out together.